I have been decorating cakes for about 25 years. I did it professionally for a while, but in recent years I've just kind of been doing it as a hobby. But with my current job and the travel involved in that, I didn't really have time to do it much. But with the current pandemic going on, I haven't been traveling as much, and so I've had a little bit more time at home and I've been doing a lot of baking. So here is a video showing you how I made this cake during my quarantine. So the recipe for this cake is called a 1, 2, 3, 4 cake, and it's basically a cup of butter, 2 cups of sugar, 3 cups of flour, and 4 eggs. And then you add another cup of milk and a tablespoon of vanilla extract. So I like to measure my ingredients with a scale. That makes it more accurate. So I just weighed out the flour, and weighed out the sugar, and just dumped them straight into the bowl. Now I did not have self-rising flour, so I just added a tablespoon of baking powder and 3/4 teaspoon of salt to substitute for that. Once I had that on the mixer, I just turned the mixer on and let it kind of come together there. And then I added my room temperature softened butter, just a little bit at a time. Now this is a little different from normal cake recipes where you mix all the wet ingredients together first, you cream the butter and the sugar and you add the eggs. This is called the paste method, where you basically add your dry ingredients and add the butter to them to kind of form a sandy looking texture. And what happens here is the butter will coat the flour and it prevents as much gluten from being formed, so you have like a nice tender cake and you don't have to worry about it being too tough. So once you have kind of a wet sand texture, you add your liquid ingredients all at one time. Now I actually substituted here. I used a 1/2 cup of milk and a 1/2 cup of sour cream mixed together, and I dumped my vanilla into it, mixed it all together as well. Then you just get that all combined together, let it mix at medium speed for about 30 seconds, and then you start adding your eggs. Now I also made a little substitution here. Instead of 4 eggs, I used 4 egg whites and then added a whole egg to it too, but you can use 4 whole eggs to keep it, standard 1, 2, 3, 4 cake. And I just add those one at a time, mixing 30 seconds at medium speed after each one is added. And then after you add your last one, you mix for another 30 seconds on medium, high speed. And that's basically the cake mix. It's ready to go into your prepared pans, which I have lined with parchment paper and then sprayed with a baking spray. Now you can totally weigh these out and make sure that they're exactly even. I didn't really care. I just kind of eyeballed it. Just dumped my cake batter into my pans. Make sure you get every last drop there. Then I kind of just smooth it out a little bit, and then I tap it up to release some of the air bubbles and give it a little spin to kind of level it out a little bit. And then it's ready to go into a 350-degree oven for 30 to 35 minutes, or until it tests that it's done by sticking it with a toothpick. And there is our golden brown cake. So then it's time to move on to the decorating. I have a turntable here that makes it easier to get all the way around the cake, and then a cake board. Now these cakes, I did wrap them in plastic wrap and put them in the freezer for a bit. I suggest doing this. It makes working with them a whole lot easier than trying to frost a newly baked cake. Putting them in the freezer just firms them up and it makes it easier for them to handle. Now the frosting I'm using here, the recipe for it is in my video on my decorated mall cake, or mall cookie cake. I'll link it here so you can get the recipe for that. I'm just using the leftover that I had left over from that. So I put a little bit of frosting on the board just to keep the cake from moving around. And then it was time for the crumb coat. Now the first thing I'm going to do is called damming the cake. You pipe just a ridge around to keep your filling from coming out, and then you can fill this cake with whatever you want. That dam keeps the filling from coming out. I'm just using more frosting here. I just blobbed some on there and I'm just smoothing it out with the spatula. Then I set my other cake on top. Now, of course, if the cake is uneven, you can trim it to make sure that it sits completely level and flat. And ordinarily you start with the top of the cake. For some reason I started with the sides here. I don't know. Maybe it's because I was out of practice. But I'm just putting a thin coat on the outside, just smoothing some on there first, and then you'll take off the excess once you get it all on there. So I'm just kind of smearing some on the outside, some on the top, bringing out the excess that has come up from the top to the center of the top of the cake, and then just going back and removing the excess frosting. You can see I'm taking the spatula around and just kind of scraping it off and then putting it back in the bowl. Now once the crumb cake's done, it goes back in the freezer for 30 minutes or so just to firm up. Because I used full butter in this, it doesn't take that long for it to firm up in the freezer. Now with my just plain vanilla frosting, I'm mixing up the colors that I wanted for my decoration. I'm doing a pink for the flowers and a green for the leaves. And this gel coloring that I have, the green is kind of bold and I kind of lime greeny when you mix it up, and I didn't care for that. So to tone it down, I squirted a little bit of pink in with it too. Green and red are opposites on the color wheel, so when you put them together, they kind of make a brown color, and I wanted it to be kind of a muted green. So more green than pink, but the pink is put in there just to kind of darken it up, and you can see it darkened it quite a bit. So once my frosting had firmed up, it was time for the final coat. So I start on the top of the cake with a dollop of frosting, and I move it around with the spatula. And a big problem people have with learning to frost cakes is they want to take the spatula, put it in the frosting, and drag the frosting across the top of the cake, which tears up your cake. What you should do is push the frosting. You always keep a mound of frosting at the front of your spatula and you're pushing it across the cake. You're not dragging it and pulling it across the cake. So I smeared some on the top and then on the sides. And you see it is kind of airy. This is a very airy frosting. And to smooth it out, smooth all those air holes out of it, here's a trick. It is a full butter frosting, so it does melt at room temperature. Or at least softens at room temperature. What I'm using here is a cup of very, very hot water, and I'm just dipping my spatula into it to get it hot, wiping off the excess water, and then smoothing the hot spatula across the frosting. And you can see it really smooths out those air holes. So then I started with the shell. I have a piping maker fitted with a shell tip, and I'm just I slowed this down so you can see it here. I'm just putting the shell border across the top. And a lot of people think when you're doing the shell borders, you have to lift up and overlap the shells. It's really not so much that. It is basically just pushing harder pressure and then releasing the pressure as you drag the shell out, and they will kind of automatically overlap each other when you do that. You don't have to have this dramatic wrist movement to get it to overlap. So I just do the shell around the top of the cake, establishing my border. Just squeezing firm pressure and then letting the pressure off as I drag the bag across. And then I'll show you a different perspective here from my point of view as I'm doing this around the bottom. I put a second shell border around the bottom, just doing the same thing, squeezing harder pressure and releasing the pressure as I pull the bag across. And then came the flowers. Now, your flowers really need to be planned out where you put them. That's my biggest pet peeve, is when I see a cake with just flowers just stuck on it somewhere. So what I'm doing here is drawing the vines first. I just have a writing tip, a number 3 writing tip that I just drew out some vines, And then I'm going to plan where I put my roses. I'm going to put a little dollop of frosting where I want each rose to go. And that rose will sit up on top of that dollop of frosting and then give you room to put leaves around it. So I'm going to make a rose here. I have my rose nail and my rose tip. It's a 104 rose tip. And to start out, you just squirt a mound of icing in the middle of your tip. Then with the tip facing with the larger part at the bottom, the narrower part at the top, you make a border around that dollop of frosting. You see there the direction I have the tip, the thinner part at the top. And then I make the center of the rose, turning the nail at the same time as I'm applying equal pressure. And then you just make petals around that. You make one petal, and then the next petal starts at the center of the previous petal. And you just go up and down in kind of a U-shaped motion, overlapping the petals as you go, applying even pressure the entire time. And you put as many rows of petals. It's, standard large size rose has 3 rows of petals. You put as many as you want, making sure they overlap each other. And then you just use your icing spatula to lift it up off of the nail and place it where you want. And I always take the end of my nail and kind of use that to scrape it off of the spatula there into the location that I want. So I just made 2 of those, and then I decided a third one was needed, so I made a smaller rose this time. Speed this process up a little bit for you here because it's the same as the other. I just did only 2 rows of petals instead of 3 to make it a little smaller. And then I put it there because I like my flowers to be in groups of odd numbers, so I got 3 here. And then I decided to add some rose buds to it. You just applying equal pressure. You can put a petal in the center and then a petal to either side. Just a constant. It's just kind of one hand motion. Center, left, right. And the petals kind of just stack up on top of each other and make the look of a rosebud. And then my leaf tip, I decided to put some leaves in here to make it look more realistic. And to do a leaf, you basically just apply heavy pressure and then let the pressure off as you're pulling the bag up. The harder the pressure, the larger the leaf. And of course, all this takes time to practice your pressure control of how hard you squeeze the icing bag. And then I decided to put a little decoration on the side. So with my same leaf tip, this time holding it upside down with the wider part at the top, I just put some swags. You start with lighter pressure, go to heavier pressure, and then lighter pressure again as you make the U shape around the side of the cake. And I just continued all the way around until I met up with the first one that I did. And then I wrote my message. And since this was the cake made for quarantine, I decided to write Happy Quarantine on here. Now forgive my handwriting, it's been a while since I've written on a cake, so my hand is a little shaky here. My writing is not the greatest, but this was just for me, so I didn't care. And there was the final product.